Hi students, this video is about the Civil Rights Movement. After watching this video, you should be able to explain how the Constitution protects civil rights and explain how the role of the Equal Protection Clause can both support and inspire social change. Just so you know, the College Board says that civil rights protect individuals from discrimination based on characteristics such as race, national origin, religion, and sex. These rights are guaranteed to all citizens under the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses of the United States Constitution, as well as acts of Congress. Also, just so you know, the College Board says the leadership and events associated with the civil rights movement are evidence of how the Equal Protection Clause can support and motivate social movements. So, let's examine the relationship between the civil rights movement and the Equal Protection Clause. As you know, the 14th Amendment became the basis for the civil rights movement. The 14th Amendment was one of those Civil War amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that Southern states had to accept in order to rejoin the Union after the Civil War. But that's not all the Southern states had to do to rejoin the Union. States that seceded after Abraham Lincoln was elected also had to accept American troops in the South to keep order after the Civil War. So, with the passage of the Civil War amendments, and with the Army essentially enforcing federal law, life in the South looked a lot better for African Americans immediately after the war. As a matter of fact, for a decade after the Civil War ended, many Black men were elected to both state and federal offices. That all began to change in 1876 with this weird presidential election that put Rutherford B. Hayes in the White House. Hayes guaranteed that he would take all of the troops out of the South and let the South run their own affairs. Hayes made these promises so that he could become president. After Hayes kept his promise, the South began to institute all kinds of racist laws called Jim Crow laws. These laws legally imposed segregation and separated public facilities such as schools and restrooms based on race. Sometimes we think this egregious segregation only happened in the South. And while racial segregation was mandated by law in the South, which is called de jure segregation, northern states were in some cases just as segregated. It's just that northern segregation wasn't mandated by law, but the North was in reality segregated. We call that de facto segregation, which means in reality. Both terms, de jure and de facto segregation, are important for you to know. So, while racism and segregation continue to exist, that Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment remained out there, giving hope to oppressed peoples and interest groups like the NAACP, because with the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause, they knew that the Constitution was on their side. The Supreme Court case that gave the civil rights movement some forward momentum was Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education overturned the separate but equal doctrine established by the 1896 case Plessy versus Ferguson. In the Brown case, the Warren Court, in a unanimous decision, said the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause made segregation inherently unconstitutional. And thus, with the Brown case, de jure segregation was over. However, such radical change would not come easy, and many white people, especially in the South, held on to tradition based on segregation and racism. Nonetheless, with the Brown decision interpretation of the 14th Amendment, the civil rights movement had some momentum. Civil rights leaders used tactics such as sit-ins, marches, and civil disobedience to end policies that segregated people by race. That being said, there were still problems. In Brown, the court said that states should end segregation with all deliberate speeds. But many school districts still are essentially segregated. In some ways, because of sociological trends like white flight and areas that are riddled with poverty. segregation still exists in reality. It's de facto segregation. So that's that. Now that you've seen this video, you should be able to explain how the 14th Amendment and the Supreme Court, especially the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, protected people from discrimination. And you should be able to explain how the Equal Protection Clause and the Brown decision inspired civil rights leaders to push for more needed change in our country.